The gunshot echoed across Wilcox, Arizona territory. 1883, startling birds from their perches and causing Frances Pierce to spill the tray of whiskey she'd been carrying. The amber liquid splashed across the white apron of her serving dress, and in that moment, she knew she was in trouble. The saloon fell silent as Barton Weeks, the saloon owner, rose from his chair, his face twisted in rage at the wasted liquor that represented a day's wages. "You clumsy whore," he snarled, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and tobacco. "That's the third time this week." Frances stepped backward, her green eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Weeks. The gunshot startled me. I'll pay for it from my wages." Barton laughed, a hollow sound that sent chills down her spine. "Your wages? You think I keep you around for your serving skills?" His meaty hand grabbed her wrist. "You've been nothing but trouble since you arrived. I'm done with you." The patrons watched, some with pity, others with cruel amusement as Barton dragged Frances through the saloon. She struggled against his grip, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins. At 22, Frances had endured much in her short life, but the public humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain. "Please," she begged. "I have nowhere to go." Barton ignored her pleas. With one powerful shove, he thrust her through the batwing doors. Frances tumbled down the wooden steps of the Desert Rose Saloon, landing hard in the dirt street. Pain shot through her palms and knees as she tried to break her fall. Her threadbare dress tore at the shoulder, exposing more skin than was proper, even for a saloon girl. "Don't come back," Barton shouted from the doorway. "You're finished in Wilcox." Frances tried to stand, but her ankle gave way. Tears of pain and humiliation threatened to spill down her cheeks, but she held them back. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as townsfolk paused to stare at her predicament. Some whispered behind their hands, others simply walked by, pretending not to notice. In a town where a woman had few options beyond marriage or working in establishments like the Desert Rose, Frances knew her reputation, already precarious, was now destroyed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A chestnut stallion stopped a few feet from where she lay, and she found herself staring at a pair of worn leather boots. Her gaze traveled upward over dust-covered denim pants, a gun belt with a Colt revolver, a blue cotton shirt, and finally to the face of a man she'd never seen before. He wasn't particularly handsome in the conventional way. His face was too weathered. His nose had been broken at least once, and a thin scar ran along his jaw. But his eyes, deep blue and piercing, held something rare in Wilcox: kindness. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. Without a word, he knelt beside her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his stubbled jaw. "Can you stand, miss?" His voice was deep, with a hint of a southern accent. Frances attempted to rise again, wincing as her ankle protested. "I think I twisted my ankle." The man's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the saloon, where Barton stood watching from the doorway. A crowd had gathered, eager for more entertainment. "Allow me," the stranger said, and in one smooth motion he gathered Frances into his arms. The unexpected kindness nearly broke her composure. She stiffened, unaccustomed to gentle handling. The man turned toward the saloon, his eyes locking with Barton's across the dusty street. The saloon owner's sneer faltered under the intensity of the stranger's gaze. "Never again," the cowboy said, his voice carrying across the stillness that had fallen over the street. It wasn't clear if he was speaking to Frances, to Barton, or to the town itself. But there was a promise in those two words, a vow that held more weight than any Frances had ever heard. He turned away from the saloon and carried her toward the boardwalk, ignoring the stares of the townsfolk. "I'm Dawson Forrester," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "And I believe you've been treated unjustly, miss." "Frances," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frances Pierce." "Well, Miss Pierce, let's get you somewhere safe." He settled her gently on the wooden bench outside the general store. "Wait here, I'll be right back." Frances watched as Dawson tied his horse to the hitching post and disappeared into the store. She considered running, though, where she would go with a twisted ankle and no possessions. She couldn't say. Before she could make a decision, Dawson returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. "The mercantile had a shawl," he explained, unwrapping it to reveal a simple blue woolen wrap. "For your modesty." Frances realized her torn dress was exposing more than was proper, and heat rushed to her cheeks. She accepted the shawl gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester, but I can't repay you. I just lost my position and my lodgings were part of my employment." Dawson's expression darkened momentarily. "That man had no right to treat you that way, Miss Pierce." He hesitated, then continued, "I have a small ranch just outside of town. My sister was staying with me until recently when she married and moved to Tucson. Her room is empty." He cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "I'm offering you shelter, not impropriety. You can stay until you decide your next steps." Frances stared at him, searching for any sign of deception. Men didn't offer charity without expecting something in return. That was a lesson she'd learned early and painfully. But Dawson's eyes held no hidden agenda she could detect. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked. Dawson's gaze drifted to the distant mountains. "My mother was once in a similar situation. No one helped her." He looked back at Frances. "I swore I'd never walk past someone in need." The simplicity of his answer struck her. In a world where survival often meant compromise, Dawson Forrester's straightforward kindness felt almost foreign. "I accept your offer," Frances said finally, "but only until I find employment elsewhere." Dawson nodded as if he'd expected no less. "Can you ride?" "My horse can carry us both the short distance to my ranch." "I can manage," she assured him, though in truth she'd rarely been on horseback. Dawson helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they walked to his horse. With gentle hands, he lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. Frances tensed at the proximity, his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins, but there was nothing suggestive in his hold. As they rode out of Wilcox, Frances felt the eyes of the town following them. She knew what they were thinking, what rumors would fly by sundown. A saloon girl riding off with a stranger, her reputation couldn't sink much lower. But for the first time in years, she found herself caring less about appearances and more about the unexpected chance at something different. Dawson's ranch was modest, a small but sturdy cabin with a barn and corral nestled against the foothills of the Dos Cabezas Mountains. A creek ran nearby, providing water for the small herd of cattle that grazed in the distance. It wasn't grand, but it was more peaceful than anywhere Frances had lived in years. "It's not much," Dawson said as he helped her dismount, "but it's mine, paid for free and clear." "It's beautiful," Frances replied honestly. After years of cramped rooms above noisy saloons, the open space and quiet felt luxurious. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove, a table with 4 chairs, and a comfortable-looking armchair by the stone fireplace. 2 doors led to what she assumed were bedrooms. "That'll be your room," Dawson said, pointing to one of the doors. "My sister left some clothes that might fit you. The washroom is out back. It's not fancy, but there's hot water if you pump it first." "Thank you," Francis said, still struggling to understand his generosity. "I can cook and clean to earn my keep while I'm here." Dawson nodded. "I won't turn down home-cooked meals. Been eating my own cooking for too long." A small smile softened his weathered features. "Rest your ankle. We can discuss arrangements tomorrow." That night, lying in a real bed with clean sheets, Francis stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the country night. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance, and occasionally she heard Dawson moving about in the main room. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt safe, truly safe, and the sensation was so foreign that sleep eluded her. Her life had been a series of compromises since her parents died of influenza when she was 16. With no family to take her in and few skills besides her beauty, she'd survived however she could. Working in saloons hadn't been her choice, but it had kept her fed. Now, a stranger had offered her shelter with seemingly no expectations. Francis wasn't naive enough to believe it would last. But for tonight, at least, she allowed herself to hope. Morning arrived with the scent of coffee and bacon. Francis dressed in one of Dawson's sister's simple cotton dresses, slightly loose in the bodice but otherwise a decent fit. Her ankle felt better, though still tender when she put weight on it. She found Dawson at the stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. He'd already been out, his boots were dusty, and his hair was damp, as if he'd washed up after morning chores. "Good morning," she said hesitantly. Dawson turned, seeming startled by her presence. "Miss Pierce, how's the ankle?" "Better, thank you, and please call me Francis," he nodded. "Francis, then. Coffee's ready if you'd like some." She poured herself a cup, watching as he deftly flipped bacon in the skillet. "You cook well for a bachelor." A faint smile touched his lips. Necessity is a harsh but effective teacher. They ate breakfast in a companionable silence. Afterward, Francis insisted on washing the dishes despite Dawson's protests. "I need to ride into town for supplies," Dawson said as she finished drying the plates. "Will you be all right here alone?" The thought of being left alone in this unfamiliar place sent a pang of anxiety through her, but Francis nodded. "Of course. I'll be fine." Dawson hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed a key on the table. "Lock the door behind me if it makes you feel safer. Not many folks come this way, but just in case." The simple gesture, trusting her with the key to his home when they'd barely met, stunned her into silence. She could only nod her thanks. After Dawson left, Francis explored the cabin more thoroughly. Her search wasn't driven by suspicion or nosiness, but by a desire to understand the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. The main room held few personal items, a bookshelf with a modest collection that surprised her with its variety. Practical guides on ranching and a Bible, but also volumes of poetry and history. On the mantel stood a single photograph in a silver frame. A handsome couple with a boy and girl, all dressed in their Sunday best. The boy had Dawson's eyes. The room that had been his sister's, now hers, was simple but comfortable, with a quilt on the bed and curtains at the window. Dawson's room, which she glimpsed through the partially open door, was spartanly neat, with a larger bed, a chest of drawers, and a rifle mounted on the wall. Nothing in the cabin suggested secrets or hidden vices. It was the home of a man who lived simply and honestly, a rarity in Francis's experience. She spent the day resting her ankle and preparing a stew from the ingredients she found in the pantry. The domestic task soothed her, reminding her of happier times before her parents' deaths, when she'd helped her mother in their Kansas kitchen. Dawson returned late in the afternoon, his horse loaded with supplies. He seemed surprised to find the cabin filled with the aroma of cooking food. "You didn't have to cook," he said, but the appreciation in his eyes belied his words. "It's the least I can do," Francis replied. "Did you have any trouble in town?" Dawson's expression tightened slightly. Weeks was running his mouth at the saloon. "Nothing I couldn't handle." "What did he say?" Francis asked, though she could imagine. Dawson busied himself with unloading packages onto the table. "Nothing worth repeating. But I did speak with Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house. She's looking for help with cleaning and cooking. If you're interested, she could offer you a job and a room once your ankle's healed." Francis felt an unexpected twinge of disappointment. Of course, he was already arranging for her to leave. She was an inconvenience, a responsibility he hadn't asked for. "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." Dawson glanced at her, then away. "You're welcome to stay here until then. No rush." That evening they ate together by lamplight. Francis found herself watching Dawson when he wasn't looking the way his hands, calloused but gentle, handled his utensils with surprising grace, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. Dawson looked up, seemingly surprised by her interest. "Not much to tell. I came to Arizona Territory 8 years ago after the war, worked as a hand on the Carter spread north of here, saved every penny. When this piece of land came up for sale 3 years back, I took a chance." He shrugged. "Been building it up since. I run about 40 head of cattle now, nothing fancy. Do some breaking and training of horses on the side." "You came alone?" Francis asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "No, it's all right." Dawson set down his fork. "My parents died when I was young. That's them in the photograph with my sister and me. An uncle raised us back in Virginia. After the war." He paused, something dark flickering across his expression. "After the war, I needed space. Elizabeth, my sister, stayed with our uncle until she turned 18, then came out to join me. She met her husband at a church social last year." Francis nodded, understanding the need for new beginnings all too well. "I came west after my parents died. I was 16, thought I'd find work as a seamstress or a teacher's assistant. I had some education." She gave a bitter laugh. "Turns out no one wanted to hire a girl alone. The saloons were always hiring, though." "You do what you must to survive," Dawson said, no judgment in his voice. "No shame in that." His acceptance, so freely given, loosened something tight in Francis's chest. For years, she'd carried the weight of others' condemnation until she'd almost come to believe it herself. To have someone, especially a man, see past her circumstances to her humanity was a gift she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Dawson merely nodded, but something in his eyes made Francis's heart beat a little faster. It wasn't desire or pity, it was recognition. As if he saw in her something familiar, something worth knowing. The days fell into an easy rhythm. Francis's ankle improved rapidly, and she took on more household tasks, finding satisfaction in creating order and comfort. Dawson worked from dawn until dusk, tending to his cattle, mending fences, and training the 2 young horses in the corral. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation that grew more comfortable with each passing day. Francis learned that Dawson had fought for the Confederacy, not from conviction but because Virginia was his home. He spoke little of the war, but the shadows in his eyes when the subject arose told her enough. He was well read despite his lack of formal education, with opinions on everything from politics to poetry that sometimes surprised her. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Kansas, her parents' small farm, and her dreams of becoming a schoolteacher before necessity had forced her onto a different path. She found herself sharing thoughts and memories she'd kept locked away for years, trusting him in a way she'd trusted no one since her parents' deaths. A week passed, then 2. Francis's ankle healed completely, but neither of them mentioned her leaving. The position at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house remained open, but Dawson didn't press her to take it, and Francis found herself reluctant to bring it up. Then came the day that changed everything. Francis was hanging laundry in the yard when the sound of approaching horses broke the midday quiet. She shaded her eyes, spotting 3 riders approaching from the direction of town. As they drew closer, her blood turned to ice. Barton Weeks rode in the lead, flanked by 2 men she recognized as regular patrons of the Desert Rose. She hurried inside, finding Dawson cleaning his rifle at the table. "Barton Weeks is coming," she said, her voice tight with fear, "with 2 others. Dawson's expression hardened as he rose, setting the rifle aside. "Stay inside." "Dawson, it'll be all right, Francis." His voice was calm, but she saw his hand check the revolver at his hip before he stepped outside. Francis moved to the window, watching as Dawson walked to meet the riders, stopping at the edge of the yard. His stance was relaxed, but she recognized the coiled tension in his shoulders. "Forrester," Barton called, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "Thought we should have a friendly chat." "Nothing friendly about 3 armed men riding onto a man's property uninvited," Dawson replied evenly. Barton's laugh grated on Francis's nerves. "Just wanted to check on the merchandise you took off my hands." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Pierce was one of my better girls. I was hasty in dismissing her. I've come to take her back." Francis felt sick. She'd never been one of his girls in the way. Barton was implying she'd drawn the line at serving drinks and enduring the occasional unwanted touch, but Barton had always hinted that her continued employment depended on her eventual compliance. "Miss Pierce isn't merchandise," Dawson said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's not property to be passed around or returned, and she's under my protection now." Barton's face darkened. "You threatening me, Forrester, over a saloon whore?" Dawson's hand moved closer to his revolver. "I'm asking you to leave my property and never speak of Miss Pierce in those terms again." One of Barton's companions, a burly man named Hank, who Francis remembered all too well, for his wandering hands spat on the ground. "You sweet on her, Forrester. She must be giving you quite a ride to make you this protective." Francis saw Dawson's shoulders tense, but his voice remained steady. "Last warning, leave now." Barton exchanged glances with his companions. 3 against 1, Forrester, not good odds." "I've faced worse," Dawson replied. Something in his tone must have registered with Barton, whose bravado faltered slightly. He studied Dawson for a long moment, then straightened in his saddle. "Keep the girl. She ain't worth the trouble, but Wilcox is a small town, Forrester. People talk. Your reputation's already suffering for taking in a woman like her. My reputation is my concern, not yours." Dawson took a step forward. "Now get off my land." Barton's face twisted with anger, but he wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over," he called over his shoulder as they rode away. "You'll regret crossing me, Forrester." Francis watched until the riders disappeared over the horizon before rushing outside. Dawson stood where they'd left him, his eyes still fixed on the distant riders. "Are you all right?" she asked, touching his arm gently. He turned to her, his expression softening. "I'm fine. Are you?" Francis nodded, though her hands were trembling. "I'm sorry I've brought trouble to your door." Dawson shook his head. "You didn't bring it. Men like Weeks create their own trouble." He hesitated. "Francis, what he said about you." "It wasn't true," she said quickly. "I served drinks, smiled at customers, danced sometimes, but I never—" She couldn't finish, her cheeks burning with shame and anger. "You don't need to explain," Dawson said gently. "I wouldn't judge you either way, but Weeks will spread rumors in town. It might be safer for you to move on to Tucson or Phoenix, somewhere he can't reach you." The suggestion felt like a physical blow. "You want me to leave?" "No," Dawson said, his answer immediate and emphatic. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Francis had come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. "I don't want you to leave, but I don't want you to stay because you feel you have nowhere else to go or because you feel obligated to me." Francis stepped closer, courage born of fear making her bold. "What if I stay because I want to?" Dawson's eyes met hers, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "Do you want to stay?" "Yes," she whispered, and realized it was the truest thing she'd said in years. For a moment, Dawson didn't move. Then, slowly, he raised his hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather-light, but it sent warmth cascading through her. "I want that too," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But Francis, you deserve a fresh start, a chance to build the life you wanted before circumstances forced you onto a different path. I can't offer you much." "You've offered me kindness," she replied. "Respect, safety." She took a deep breath. "No one has given me those things in a very long time." Dawson's expression softened. "You deserve all that and more." The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. Francis had built walls around her heart after years of disappointment and betrayal, but Dawson Forrester had somehow slipped past her defenses without even trying. "We should go inside," Dawson said finally, glancing toward the horizon where Barton and his men had disappeared. "I don't think they'll be back today, but just to be safe." As they walked back to the cabin, Dawson's hand rested lightly at the small of her back. The simple, protective gesture made Francis's heart swell with a feeling she was almost afraid to name. That evening, after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The day's tension had eased, replaced by a companionable silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. "I've been thinking," Dawson said finally. "If you truly want to stay, we should make it proper." Francis turned to him, uncertain of his meaning. Dawson met her gaze, his expression serious but gentle. "I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be presumptuous." A hint of color touched his cheeks. "But I could speak to Reverend Miller about announcing a formal courtship. It would give you protection under the social customs, make it clear to everyone, including Weeks, that we're not." He fumbled for words, uncharacteristically awkward. "That I'm not your mistress," Francis finished for him. Dawson nodded, his discomfort evident. "I care for your reputation, Francis, and for mine. But mostly I care for you, more than I expected to, more than might be wise after such a short acquaintance." The confession, delivered with such honest simplicity, touched Francis deeply. "I care for you too," she replied softly. "And yes, I would welcome a formal courtship." Relief and something warmer flickered in Dawson's eyes. Hesitantly, as if giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached for her hand. Francis met him halfway, their fingers intertwining. They sat in silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. It wasn't a passionate declaration or a dramatic embrace, but to Francis, who had learned to be wary of grand gestures and empty promises, the quiet connection felt more meaningful than any flowery words. The next Sunday, Francis attended church in Wilcox for the first time, seated beside Dawson in his buckboard wagon. She wore the best of his sister's dresses, a modest blue cotton with white trim, and had spent extra time arranging her hair. The prospect of facing the town's scrutiny terrified her, but she refused to show it. As Dawson helped her down from the wagon in front of the white steepled church, she felt the weight of curious stares. Whispers followed them up the church steps, and Francis kept her chin high, though her grip on Dawson's arm tightened. Reverend Miller, a kind-faced man with silver hair, greeted them at the door. "Mr. Forrester, good to see you. And this must be Miss Pierce." "Pleasure to meet you, Reverend," Francis said, grateful for his courteous nod. Inside, Dawson led her to a pew near the back. As the congregation settled, Francis was acutely aware of the sideways glances and whispered comments. The women, especially, seemed to regard her with suspicion or outright disapproval. Halfway through the service, the church door opened, and Francis froze as Barton Weeks entered, followed by several of his saloon girls and regular patrons. They had clearly been drinking, their loud whispers and stumbling steps disrupting the sermon. Barton's gaze swept the congregation until it found Francis, and the malicious smile that spread across his face sent a chill through her. Dawson's hand covered hers, his touch steadying. "Ignore him," he whispered. Reverend Miller paused his sermon, fixing Barton with a stern look. "Mr. Weeks, we welcome all souls to worship, but I must ask for reverence in God's house." Barton gave an exaggerated bow. "Of course, Reverend. Just wanted to see who's attending your fine congregation these days." His gaze lingered meaningfully on Francis. Interesting to see the desert rose represented so prominently. A murmur ran through the church as people turned to stare more openly at Francis. Heat rushed to her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral, focusing on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. After the service, Dawson spoke quietly with Reverend Miller while Francis waited, enduring the not-so-subtle scrutiny of the congregation. Some of the women deliberately turned their backs when she glanced their way, while others whispered behind gloved hands. "Francis." A soft voice broke through her discomfort. She turned to find a plump, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tentative smile. "I'm Martha Henderson. I believe Mr. Forrester spoke to me about a position at my boarding house." Francis straightened, surprised by the friendly overture. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson. It was very kind of you to consider me." Martha waved away her thanks. "Any friend of Dawson Forrester is welcome. He's a good man, helped repair my roof last winter and wouldn't take a penny for it." She lowered her voice. "Don't mind the gossips. This town has a short memory when it comes to scandals. Give them something new to talk about and they'll forget all about you." The simple kindness nearly brought tears to Francis's eyes. "Thank you." Martha patted her arm. "The position is still open if you need it, but between us, I think you've found something better." Her knowing glance toward Dawson made Francis blush. As they left the church, Barton Weeks blocked their path, his breath reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. "Playing the respectable lady, Francis. We all know what you really are." Dawson stepped forward, placing himself between Francis and Barton. "Move aside, Weeks." Barton sneered. "Or what? This is public property, not your ranch. You can't order me around here." "Is there a problem?" Reverend Miller approached, his expression concerned but firm. "Just having a friendly conversation with former employees," Barton said, his tone mocking. The Reverend's gaze shifted between the men, assessing the tension. "Mr. Weeks, I believe you've had enough conversation for today. Sunday is a day of peace." For a moment, it seemed Barton might argue, but the presence of the Reverend and the watching congregation seemed to give him pause. With a final glare at Dawson, he stepped aside. "This ain't over, Forrester." As they drove back to the ranch, Francis sat in miserable silence, the day's events weighing heavily on her spirit. "I'm sorry," Dawson said finally. "I shouldn't have subjected you to that." Francis shook her head. "It's not your fault. It's who I am, who I was. I can't escape my past." Dawson pulled the buckboard to a stop on the deserted road, turning to face her. "Francis, look at me." When she did, his gaze was intense, unwavering. "Your past doesn't define you. We've all done things to survive, made choices we might not make again given different circumstances. What matters is who you choose to be now." His words unlocked something within her, a hope she'd almost forgotten was possible. "Do you really believe that?" "With all my heart." Dawson took her hand gently. "I've seen who you are, Frances Pierce. You're kind, resilient, stronger than you know. That's the woman I—" He hesitated, then continued more softly, "The woman I'm coming to love." The declaration, simple and heartfelt, stole Frances's breath. "Dawson." "You don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "It's too soon, I know, but I wanted you to hear it. Whatever happens with the town, with Weeks we'll face it together." Frances looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. Slowly, she leaned forward, giving him every opportunity to pull away. But Dawson met her halfway, his lips brushing hers in a kiss so gentle it made her heart ache. When they parted, Frances felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her. For so long, she'd seen herself through others' eyes as damaged goods, as someone unworthy of real affection. But Dawson saw her differently, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that his vision might be the truer one. The weeks that followed brought both challenges and joys. True to Martha Henderson's prediction, the town's interest in Frances's past gradually waned as new gossip emerged. The formal courtship, announced by Reverend Miller the following Sunday, provided a measure of social protection, though some still regarded her with suspicion. Frances found unexpected allies in Martha Henderson and Elizabeth Forrester, who visited from Tucson with her husband, and immediately welcomed Frances with warmth that suggested Dawson had written to her of their growing relationship. Elizabeth, a lively woman with her brother's blue eyes and a more ready smile, shared stories of their childhood in Virginia and offered friendship without reservation. "I've never seen my brother so content," Elizabeth confided during her visit. "He's carried such weight since the war." "You're good for him, Frances." The words warmed Frances deeply, though she protested. "He's been my salvation. I haven't done anything for him." Elizabeth's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise. "Sometimes just being present is enough. Dawson has always taken care of others. Having someone who sees him truly sees him is a gift I feared he might never accept." The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Frances discovered a talent for gardening, coaxing vegetables from the dusty soil with patient care. She learned to help with the cattle, initially terrified of the massive beasts, but gradually growing confident under Dawson's patient instruction. In turn, Dawson seemed to soften in her presence. The quiet, reserved man who had rescued her from the street gradually revealed a dry wit and unexpected tenderness. In the evenings, he sometimes read aloud from his books of poetry, his deep voice giving new meaning to the familiar words. Their courtship progressed with appropriate restraint in public, but in private, their connection deepened with each passing day. Dawson was unfailingly respectful, never presuming or pushing for more than Frances freely offered. Their kisses grew more frequent, more passionate, but he always drew back before things progressed too far, his respect for her evident in his restraint. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset, Dawson turned to Frances with unusual solemnity. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression troubled. "About my past." Frances's heart quickened with apprehension, but she nodded encouragingly. "You can tell me anything, Dawson." He drew a deep breath. "During the war, I did things, saw things that haunt me still. I was barely 18 when I enlisted, thought I was fighting for home and honor." A bitter smile touched his lips. "Found out quick enough there's no honor in war, just survival and blood." Frances took his hand, offering silent support. "After Appomattox, I couldn't go home. Couldn't face my uncle, my sister, knowing what I'd done. So I drifted west, took whatever work I could find." his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I was in a dark place, Francis, drinking too much, picking fights, not caring whether I lived or died." He turned to her, his eyes shadowed with remembered pain. "One night in a mining town in Colorado, I got into a brawl with a man over something trivial, a spilled drink, I think. It went bad. I hurt him badly, might have killed him if others hadn't pulled me off." His voice roughened. "I left town that night, rode until my horse couldn't go further. Ended up in Arizona territory and somehow the land here. It gave me space to breathe, to start healing." Francis absorbed his confession, understanding now the shadows that sometimes crossed his face, the nightmares that occasionally disturbed his sleep. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "It doesn't change how I feel about you." Relief flickered in his eyes. "There's more. The man in Colorado, I never knew if he lived or died. I've carried that uncertainty for years." He drew another deep breath. "2 days ago, I received a letter from a lawyer in Denver. Seems the man survived, but with permanent injuries. He's been looking for me for years, wants compensation." Frances felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "What will you do?" "The right thing," Dawson said simply. "I've been saving to expand the ranch, but that money will go to him instead. It's the least I can do." He squeezed her hand. "I wanted you to know because it might change things for us. I won't be able to provide the kind of life I'd hoped to offer you, at least not for some time." The revelation of Dawson's past and its consequences should have given Frances pause. Instead, she felt a surge of admiration for his integrity, his willingness to face his mistakes and make amends regardless of the cost. "It changes nothing," she assured him. "My feelings for you aren't based on what you can provide materially. I've lived with very little most of my life, Dawson. What I couldn't live without now is you." Dawson's expression softened, gratitude and something deeper shining in his eyes. "I love you, Frances Pierce. I think I have since the moment I saw you in that Wilcox Street, refusing to be broken by cruelty." "I love you too," Frances replied, the words coming easily now, naturally, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to say them. Dawson drew her into his arms, his kiss more fervent than before, filled with promise and newfound certainty. When they parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Not someday, not when circumstances are perfect. Now." Frances pulled back slightly, searching his face. "Are you certain?" "With everything that's happening, more certain than I've ever been of anything," Dawson interrupted. "Life is uncertain, Frances. The war taught me that. All we have for sure is this moment, and I want to spend every moment I have left with you as my wife." The simple, heartfelt proposal brought tears to Frances's eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." The day of their wedding dawned clear and crisp, with autumn painting the distant mountains in shades of gold and amber. They married in the Wilcox Church with a small gathering of witnesses, Elizabeth and her husband, Martha Henderson, a few of Dawson's ranching neighbors, and to Frances's surprise, Reverend Miller's wife, who had quietly befriended her in recent weeks. Barton Weeks was noticeably absent from town, having departed for Tucson 2 weeks earlier after losing the Desert Rose Saloon in a poker game to a traveling businessman from San Francisco. The new owner had already begun transforming it into a more respectable establishment, much to the approval of the town's matrons. Frances wore a simple cream-colored dress that Elizabeth had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Dawson, clean-shaven and solemn in his best suit, watched her walk toward him with such undisguised love that Frances felt her heart might burst with happiness. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows exchanged in voices steady with conviction. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Dawson kissed her with reverent tenderness, his hands gentle on her waist. "Mrs. Forrester," he whispered against her lips, and Frances felt the rightness of it deep in her soul. The small reception at Martha Henderson's boarding house was warm and convivial, with music from a fiddle player and food contributed by the guests. Frances, who had once believed she would never be accepted in Wilcox society, found herself welcomed with genuine kindness by most of those present. As the celebration continued, Dawson drew her outside to the quiet garden behind the boarding house. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," Frances answered truthfully. Dawson's expression grew serious. "I sent the money to Colorado yesterday. Most of our savings, but we'll manage." He brushed a curl from her face. "I wanted to start our marriage with a clean slate." Frances touched his cheek gently. "We both have pasts, Dawson. What matters is the future we build together." His smile illuminated his features, erasing the worry lines that had marked his brow in recent days. "I never thought I'd find you. After everything I've done, everything I've been, to be granted such happiness feels like more than I deserve." "Perhaps that's the nature of grace," Frances suggested. "Given freely, not earned." Dawson's kiss was his answer, a promise sealed beneath the Arizona sky. Their wedding night was a revelation. Dawson's tenderness, his patience as he guided Frances through unfamiliar intimacy, transformed what she had once feared into a profound connection that left her breathless with wonder. In the sanctuary of their bedroom, with moonlight streaming through the curtains, she learned the language of love in its purest form, not as transaction or obligation, but as mutual gift. Afterward, lying in his arms, Frances traced the scar that ran along his jaw. "How did you get this?" Dawson caught her hand, kissing her fingertips. "Barbed wire. First year on my own ranch, I was in a hurry mending a fence before a storm hit. Carelessness." Frances smiled, loving these small discoveries, these pieces of him she was collecting like precious stones. "And the broken nose." A rueful laugh escaped him. "That mining town in Colorado before the fight that changed everything. I wasn't always the restrained man you know now." "I love the man you are," Frances assured him. "And I would have loved the boy you were, the soldier you became. All of it made you Dawson Forrester, the man who lifted me from the dust and said never again." Dawson's arms tightened around her. "Best decision I ever made, stopping in Wilcox that day." As autumn deepened into winter, Frances and Dawson settled into married life with a contentment that sometimes felt almost miraculous given their troubled pasts. The ranch prospered despite the financial setback of Dawson's restitution payment. His reputation for fair dealing and skilled horse training brought steady work, while Frances's garden provided not only for their table but surplus they sold in town. The Wilcox community, once so suspicious of Frances, gradually accepted her as Mrs. Forrester, especially after she began assisting Martha Henderson with organizing care packages for the town's poorer residents. Even Mrs. Thornton, the banker's wife and self-appointed arbiter of Wilcox society, eventually nodded to Frances after church services. In February, Frances confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting a child. When she told Dawson, his joy was so profound it brought tears to her eyes. That night, he spent hours building a cradle, working by lamplight long after Frances had retired to bed. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers, and Frances's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body blossoming as new life grew within her. Dawson was attentive to the point of hovering, which amused Elizabeth when she visited from Tucson. "He was the same when I twisted my ankle as a child," Elizabeth confided. "Wouldn't let me move for a week. You'll have to assert yourself, or he'll have you confined to bed for the entire 9 months." Frances laughed, but she cherished Dawson's concern. After years of fending for herself, having someone who cared so deeply for her well-being felt like the greatest luxury. In late April, as Frances entered her 5th month, Dawson rode to town for supplies while she remained at the ranch, resting after a morning of light gardening. The sound of approaching horses roused her from a nap, and she went to the window, expecting to see Dawson returning. Instead, she saw 3 riders she didn't recognize, rough-looking men with the dust of the trail on their clothes and hard expressions on their weather-beaten faces. They dismounted in the yard, and Frances felt a flutter of apprehension. Dawson had taught her to use the rifle that hung over the fireplace, but she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Straightening her apron over the small swell of her pregnancy, she stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The tallest of the 3 removed his hat, revealing salt and pepper hair and a face scarred by smallpox. "Madam, we're looking for Dawson Forrester." "My husband is in town," Frances replied, keeping her voice steady. "He should return shortly. May I ask your business with him?" The men exchanged glances, and the oldest man spoke again. "Personal matter. We'll wait if you don't mind." Though phrased as a request, it didn't sound optional. Frances nodded, her mind racing. "Would you care for coffee while you wait? It's a warm day." The offer seemed to surprise them, but after a moment the spokesman nodded. "Much obliged, madam." Frances returned to the kitchen, her heart pounding. As she prepared coffee, she tried to make sense of the visitors. They didn't seem like typical ranch hands or townspeople. Their clothing and bearing suggested men accustomed to a harder life, perhaps miners or drifters. The rifle was within reach, but using it against 3 armed men would be foolish unless absolutely necessary. She brought coffee to the porch, where the men had seated themselves on the benches. They accepted the cups with muttered thanks, and an uncomfortable silence fell. "You Forrester's wife long?" the youngest man asked finally, breaking the tension. "Since last autumn," Frances replied, deciding honesty was safest. The older man nodded thoughtfully. "Didn't know he'd married." Before Frances could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced another arrival. Relief washed through her as Dawson rode into the yard, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness as he registered the visitors. "Gentlemen," he said, dismounting but keeping his hand near his holstered revolver. "What can I do for you?" The older man stood, setting aside his coffee cup. "Been a long time, Forrester." Dawson stilled, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Jameson, didn't expect to see you again." "Figured as much, considering how you left Colorado." Jameson's voice hardened. "Thomas Dixon sends his regards." Frances saw Dawson pale slightly at the name. "Dixon," he repeated. "He sent you." Jameson nodded. "Got your money. Wanted us to deliver a message personally." He gestured to his companions, who had also risen, their hands resting too casually near their weapons. Dawson moved subtly, positioning himself between the men and Frances. "Whatever message Dixon has, it's between him and me. My wife has nothing to do with it." "Oh, we know that," Jameson agreed, his tone unnervingly pleasant. "Dixon was quite clear no harm to come to innocence. Just you, Forrester. An eye for an eye, as they say in the good book." Understanding dawned on Frances with sickening clarity. These weren't messengers, they were here for retribution. The money Dawson had sent hadn't satisfied Dixon's desire for justice. "Dawson," she said quietly, touching his arm. "What's happening?" He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on Jameson. "Go inside, Frances." "Yes, madam, you might want to do that," Jameson agreed. "This isn't a sight for a lady, especially in your condition." His eyes flickered to her belly, and Frances felt cold fear wash through her. How long had they been watching the ranch before approaching? What did they know? If Dixon sent you to kill me, you should know the territorial marshal in Tucson is aware of the situation, Dawson said evenly. I wrote to him when I sent the money, explained everything. Kill me, and you'll hang. Jameson laughed. Nice try, Forrester. But we both know the law out here has a short memory and a shorter reach. He glanced at his companions. Dixon didn't specify killing, though. Said to use our judgment, make you suffer like he suffered. 7 years of pain, being half a man because of what you did. Francis saw the guilt flash across Dawson's face, quickly replaced by determination. Then let's settle this, man to man. Just you and me, Jameson. The older man considered this, then shook his head. 3-1 seems fairer, considering what you did to Dixon. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Francis knew she should obey Dawson's order to go inside, but she couldn't leave him to face this alone. A desperate idea formed in her mind. Mr. Jameson, she said, stepping forward despite Dawson's attempt to keep her behind him. My husband has paid his debt to Mr. Dixon. The money he sent represented everything we had saved. Jameson's expression didn't soften. Money doesn't fix what he broke, madam. Nothing can undo the past, Francis agreed, but more violence won't heal Mr. Dixon's injuries. It will only create new victims. She placed her hand protectively over her abdomen, including an innocent child who's never drawn breath. The youngest of the 3 men shifted uncomfortably at this, and Francis pressed her advantage. Is that what Mr. Dixon truly wants? To orphan a child before it's born, to make me a widow when my husband has been trying to make amends. Jameson hesitated, clearly not having anticipated this complication. Dixon didn't mention a child. How could he know? Francis replied. But you know now. And you'll have to live with that knowledge if you harm my husband. A tense silence fell over the yard. Dawson stood rigid beside Francis, his expression a mix of pride and fear for her boldness. The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances, their resolve visibly wavering. Finally, Jameson spoke. Dixon wanted justice, an eye for an eye. And he received it, Dawson replied firmly. Every penny I'd saved, sent with a full confession and apology. I can't undo what happened, but I've tried to make it right. Jameson studied him, then looked at Francis, his hard gaze softening slightly. A man once told me the measure of justice is whether it brings peace or more suffering. Seems like killing you would just spread the suffering to those who had no part in the original wrong. Hope flared in Francis's chest, though she kept her expression neutral. Tell Dixon I received his message, Dawson said quietly. Tell him I live with what I did every day, and that I'm truly sorry for his suffering. But also tell him that coming after my family will bring a response he isn't prepared for. The threat was delivered calmly, but Francis heard the steel beneath the words. So apparently did Jameson, who nodded slowly. I'll tell him, he agreed. Can't promise he'll listen, but I'll tell him. He turned to his companions. Mount up, boys, we're done here. As they prepared to leave, Jameson paused beside his horse, looking back at Francis. You've got courage, madam. Reminds me of my own wife, God rest her soul. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture almost like respect before swinging into the saddle. They watched in tense silence as the 3 riders disappeared down the road toward town. Only when they were out of sight did Dawson pull Francis into his arms, his embrace almost desperate in its intensity. That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen, he murmured against her hair. Francis clung to him, the delayed reaction making her knees weak. Do you think they're really gone, that it's over? Dawson drew back to look at her, his expression grave. I don't know, but we can't live in fear, Francis. He touched her cheek gently. You were magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent. A shaky laugh escaped her. I was terrified, but I couldn't let them hurt you, Dawson, not when we've found such happiness. Dawson's hand moved to rest protectively over her belly. "I need to speak with the marshal in Tucson, make him aware of what happened. And perhaps we should visit Elizabeth for a while, until I'm sure Dixon has accepted the situation." Francis nodded, understanding the precaution. "When should we leave?" "Tomorrow," Dawson decided. "We'll pack tonight. I want you and our child safe, Francis. Nothing matters more than that." That evening, as they prepared for their journey, Francis watched Dawson move about the cabin with controlled urgency. Despite his calm demeanor, she sensed the turmoil beneath the fear not for himself, but for her and their unborn child, the guilt over how his past had intruded on their hard-won peace. "It's not your fault," she said softly as they lay in bed that night, her head resting on his chest. "We all have pasts that follow us." Dawson's hand stroked her hair, his touch gentle despite the tension in his body. "I should have told you everything from the beginning, about Dixon, about what really happened in that Colorado saloon." "You told me enough," Francis assured him. "The details don't change who you are now, the man I love." His arms tightened around her. "I don't deserve you, Francis Forrester." "Perhaps not," she teased gently, "but you're stuck with me anyway." His low chuckle vibrated against her ear, a reassuring sound in the darkness. They fell asleep entwined, finding comfort in each other despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. The journey to Tucson took 3 days by wagon, following the dusty trail through mountain passes and across valleys blooming with spring wildflowers. Elizabeth welcomed them with open arms, her husband offering Dawson work on the small but prosperous freight business he had established. After speaking with the territorial marshal, who promised to monitor the situation and send word if Dixon or his men were spotted in the area, Dawson seemed to relax slightly. The days stretched into weeks, and as Francis's pregnancy progressed, the specter of Dixon's vengeance receded somewhat from their immediate concerns. Elizabeth proved to be a godsend, her practical experience with childbirth and infant care reassuring Francis as her due date approached. The sisters-in-law grew closer, spending hours preparing for the baby's arrival while Dawson worked alongside Elizabeth's husband, Robert. "He watches you like you might disappear if he blinks too long," Elizabeth observed one afternoon as they stitched baby clothes. "I've never seen my brother so besotted." Francis smiled, looking out the window to where Dawson was visible in the yard, repairing a wagon wheel. "The feeling is mutual. Sometimes I wake in the night and watch him sleeping, just to reassure myself that this is real, that we found each other despite everything." Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "It's real, and soon there will be another Forrester to love." In late August, as the summer heat reached its peak, Francis went into labor. The birth was difficult, nearly 20 hours of pain that tested her endurance to its limits. Dawson paced outside the bedroom door, driven nearly to distraction by her cries, until Elizabeth's husband practically forced him to sit. Just as dawn broke over the Tucson Mountains, Francis delivered a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. When Elizabeth finally allowed Dawson into the bedroom, Francis watched through exhausted eyes as her husband approached the bed with reverent steps. "You have a son," she whispered, pulling back the blanket to reveal the tiny face. Dawson's expression transformed with wonder as he gazed down at his child. When Francis placed the baby in his arms, his hands so capable with horses and cattle, so deadly once in war, cradled the infant with infinite gentleness. "Samuel," he said softly, looking at Francis for confirmation. They had discussed names, settling on Samuel for a boy after Francis's father. She nodded, her heart so full it ached. "Samuel Dawson Forrester." Dawson bent to kiss her forehead, his lips lingering. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "For him, for everything." 3 months later, with no sign of Dixon or his men and a thriving, healthy son, they decided it was safe to return to their ranch. The homecoming was bittersweet. The cabin was just as they had left it, but somehow it felt different, as if the events of that spring day had left an invisible mark on the place they had made their home. But as weeks passed without incident, they gradually settled back into a routine, now centered around Samuel's needs and milestones. Dawson hired 2 ranch hands to help with the cattle, allowing him more time with Frances and the baby. The ranch prospered, and by Samuel's first birthday, they had saved enough to begin expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for their son. Life wasn't without challenges. The drought that struck Arizona territory in 1885 tested their resources and resilience. But they faced each difficulty together, their bond strengthened by the trials they had overcome. Frances never forgot that moment in Wilcox when she lay in the dust of the street, her dignity in tatters, and a stranger's hand reached down to her. Sometimes, watching Dawson with their son teaching him to ride his first pony, showing him how to plant corn in the garden soil, she marveled at how that single act of kindness had transformed both their lives. In the spring of 1886, as Samuel approached his 3rd birthday, Frances discovered she was expecting their 2nd child. When she told Dawson, his joy was just as profound as it had been the first time. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel asleep inside after an exhausting day of toddler adventures, Dawson took her hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming here with me that day, all we've been through?" Frances looked at him, this man who had saved her in more ways than he would ever understand. "Not for a single moment," she replied truthfully. "You lifted me up when I was at my lowest. You saw value in me when everyone else saw only what they could take." How could I regret finding the greatest love of my life? Dawson's eyes, still as blue and direct as they had been that first day in Wilcox, filled with emotion. "You know, I rode into town that day with no intention of staying, was just passing through on my way to California. Thought maybe a fresh start there might ease what I was carrying." He shook his head, a small smile touching his lips. "Then I saw Barton Weeks throw you into the street and something in me just shifted. I knew I couldn't ride away." Frances leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his shoulder. "Do you believe in fate, Dawson Forrester?" He considered this, his arm encircling her waist. "I believe in grace," he said finally. "In second chances. In the kind of love that heals old wounds and builds something new from broken pieces." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I believe in us, Frances, in what we've built together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Frances thought of all the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment, the hardships they had endured, the love they had found, the family they had created. From that dusty street in Wilcox to this peaceful porch, their journey had been neither easy nor straight, but it had led them home. And that, she decided as Dawson's hand came to rest protectively over the new life growing within her, was all that truly mattered. Their 2nd child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Martha Forrester, was born in the winter of 1886, completing their family circle. As the years passed, the ranch grew and prospered. Samuel inherited his father's affinity for horses, while young Lizzie, as they called her, showed Frances's green thumb in the garden. Thomas Dixon never resurfaced in their lives. Whether Jameson's message had reached him, or whether he had found his own peace, they never knew. But the shadow of that confrontation faded with time, becoming just another story in the tapestry of their shared history. In 1898, when Samuel turned 16, Dawson finally told him the full truth about his past the war, the fight in Colorado, the restitution he had paid. Frances watched her son absorb this information with the same quiet strength his father possessed, and felt pride in the man he was becoming. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Samuel told his father that night. "You taught me that, Pa, by how you live." Dawson's eyes had met Frances's across the room, a lifetime of love and understanding passing between them in that silent exchange. They had both been broken in different ways when they met, Dawson by war and guilt, Frances by circumstance and the cruelty of others. Together, they had healed. Together, they had built a life rich in the things that truly mattered: love, family, purpose, forgiveness. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and the children were occupied with their own pursuits, Dawson and Frances would sit on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset just as they had in those early days. His hair had silver threads now, and lines fanned from the corners of his eyes. Frances's chestnut hair was beginning to show strands of gray, but when he took her hand, the touch still sent warmth cascading through her, just as it had that first time. Never again, he had promised on that dusty street in Wilcox, and he had kept his word. Never again had Frances felt abandoned or unworthy. Never again had she doubted her value or her place in the world. In Dawson's love, she had found not just safety but strength, the courage to become the woman she was meant to be. And in Frances, Dawson had found absolution and purpose, a reason to leave the shadows of his past behind and step into the light of a future brighter than he had dared to imagine. It had begun with a simple act of kindness, a hand extended to someone in need, a promise spoken from the heart. And from that moment, against all odds, they had built a love story as vast and enduring as the Arizona sky.